Season 2 of Written in Stone is generously supported by RAB, one of climbing's most historic brands. Founded in 1981 by climbers, for climbers, RAB are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business, expand access to the outdoors, and preserve our mountain playgrounds for future generations. RAB, the mountains are our meeting place. I make my living as a climbing coach. The board I recommend more than any other is the Tension Board 2. As an early adopter of systemized spray walls, it's what I always imagined boards had the potential to be. You can learn more about the TB2 at their in-depth article on what it is, how it came to be, and how to use it the way they intended, with progression toward mastery in mind. The link is in the show notes. Audio. 1985, almost 10 years since free climbing was established in France. Originally a laughing stock, it is now the rule of the game for the majority of climbers. This is how the document began. Signed by 19 of the best, most important climbers in France, it was a manifesto against climbing competitions. It continues. This vision of things is perhaps a little idealistic, but it is that of climbing as a refuge from certain archetypes of our society, as opposition to all these judged, refereed, timed, officialized, and too sneaky state-controlled sports. Idealistic? Sure. But they are the climbers, so isn't it their ideal vision of it that matters? The manifesto finishes with, tomorrow, there will perhaps be competitions and competitors with numbered bibs frolicking in front of the cameras. There will also be climbers who will continue to practice the real game of climbing. Climbers who will be the guardians of a certain essence and a certain ethic. And then the signatures. Patrick Edlinger, David Chambre, Jean-Baptiste Tribout, Laurent Jacob, Catherine Destivelle, Antoine Lemenestrel, and more. The most famous climbers in the country from both the north and the south, a rare moment of agreement. One after another, planned competitions were canceled. One important event went as far as taking out an ad that read, "Climbers are today divided on the merits of climbing competitions, and we refuse to choose for them." However, 19 climbers is not a majority. Besides, there was one very notable omission. Patrick Edlinger, the upholder of all that was sacred to the spirit of climbing, the face of climbing in France, that name, surprisingly, was nowhere to be found. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, climbing's most important ascents. This is Season 2, the 1980s.
1, 2.
Not all competitions were swayed by the manifesto. That July, in Italy, the invitational competition Spa Roccia at Bardonecchia would move forward, with many French climbers on the roster. Jacques Gaddafi, Alex Dubac, Thierry Renaud, and Didier Raboutou would all place in the top 6. Only a couple of months after signing the manifesto, France's best female climber, Catherine Destivelle, would win the competition. The first and most visible of many defectors from the manifesto, Destivelle was on the come-up, benefiting from the attention brought to the sport by Patrick Edlinger. She started to treat climbing more like a profession. A year later, she returned to Spa Roccia. This time, stakes were higher. She was now recognized as the top female climber in the world, and not only were people watching with high expectations, she had serious competition. American climber Lynn had recently completed the first 7C+ ever done by a woman and was already being billed as a worthy adversary. But for this competition, Destivelle had an ace up her sleeve. She knew the rules. The hardest route would be a 7A+, and competitors would get 3 attempts to climb it. speed would be a deciding factor. Style mattered. Destivelle took 3 tries on the final. Lynn flashed everything. So obviously, the winner was Destivelle? What? See, on points, which included difficulty, speed, and style, the two had tied. Number of attempts was not factored in, so ultimately, the organizers handed the trophy to Destivelle because she had climbed the final route faster than Lynn. Now, to Lynn, this just didn't even make sense. It seemed like a rule change had been enacted to favor the French climber, and maybe it had. Reports are conflicting. Destivelle would later write, "I was not proud of having won like that." Regardless, soon after the competition, Catherine managed to climb the first 8A ever done by a woman, one-upping Lynn's 7C+. Sponsors were pouring in. Now the competition was really heating up, in the media if nowhere else. In 1986, Lynn, always eager for a good showdown, returned to France to compete in the Grand Prix d'Escalade. Destivelle didn't compete. The next year in Grenoble, the two women finally met again. This time, during the very first climb, Destivelle stepped out of bounds and was disqualified. Not happy with the fact that the literal poster woman for the event had been disqualified, the mayor of Grenoble lobbied for Destivelle to be reinstated. She had to be there to save the event, he argued. For her part, Catherine wasn't so sure. She knew it wasn't fair, but insisted that if she was allowed to continue in the competition, that she would also be allowed to compete to win. They agreed. At the end of the regulation climbing, there was a 3-way tie. German climber Andrea Eisenhut, Lynn Hill, and Catherine Destivelle. They would have to climb one more route as a tiebreaker. Prior to the superfinal, the officials approached Destivelle and broke it to her that she couldn't continue. Eisenhut demanded that the original rules stand. Lynn, however, wanted to officially win against Catherine, so she welcomed the challenge. But Destivelle was out, physically and emotionally. The optics and rules of these competitions were beginning to wear on her. A few weeks later, the two met at another competition in Bercy. This time, Lynn won hands down. A true rivalry was brewing. And nearly simultaneously, tucked into the historic gorge of the Verdon and hidden from the competition world, tensions between two top French climbers were reaching a boiling point. This wasn't necessarily new. The styles of the Parisians and the band of climbers from the south of France, led by the most famous climber in the country, Patrick Edlinger, had been clashing since early in the 1980s. Now, it was just at a new level. Brash Parisian superstar Jibe Tribout had been working on something futuristic. Discovered via helicopter by Jacques Perrier, this wasn't a typical Verdon climb. Perrier wrapped in and placed a couple of bolts on this steep, bulging wall, but quickly realized it would be far too difficult for him. Tribout heard difficult and sprang into action, finishing the bolting and getting to work on sorting out the moves. In 1987, the dance of sport climbing played out mostly on a vertical stage, always with 3 points of contact in a slow and controlled manner. Small bulges or even short horizontal roofs were common, but sustained dramatically overhanging pitches or wild swinging moves had barely even been imagined. This pitch, however, was nearly 45 degrees overhanging with big dynamic throws between pinches, underclings, and perfect limestone edges. Tribout was getting close, and having already climbed most of the 8B plus or 14A routes in France, he was certain this was another level. If true, it could be the hardest route in the world. So when he noticed chalk marks, ones he knew he didn't make, on his route, he quickly went from perplexed to upset. It didn't really matter who it was, they were the enemy. Anyone else knew better. A quick investigation revealed that indeed, it was the enemy. Edlinger, the nerve. And at the worst, possible time. Tribout had to leave the Verdon for prior engagements, but couldn't stomach the idea of Leblanc swooping in and finishing this masterpiece while he was gone. He knew what needed to be done. There was an edge near the top of the route, a necessary edge. Without it, the route wouldn't be doable. And it was loose. Tribout had intended to reinforce it with glue to ensure the viability of the route, to preserve what would certainly be history. Instead, he pried it off, put it in his pocket, and left the Verdon. When Tribout finally returned, he epoxied the hold back into place and sent the route. Unprecedented tactics, and he gave it an unprecedented grade. Les Specialistas, 8C or 514B, the first in the world. He had no doubts that it would hold up to scrutiny. But somehow, he forgot about Edlinger. Maybe it was because Leblanc had taken to the competitions, winning nearly everything, that he assumed his route in the Verdon was safe. But the following March, Edlinger returned to the route, and with his own climbing levels rising, sent it, as he reports, easily. He promptly downgraded it to just another 8B+. Jibe was pissed. Through the French climbing magazines, he demanded to know who the hell Edlinger thought he was and that he justified the grade he'd given the route. Tribout wasn't willing to admit that Edlinger could perform at that level on rock. The tension was at an all-time high. And like most of the 19 who had signed the manifesto, Tribout had defected from his early anti-competition stance. He was also competing for the cash and the bragging rights. And he'd been invited to a big competition in America, the first in the country, and one of the first to be held on an artificial wall. It would be in Salt Lake City at the Snowbird Resort. And Edlinger had been invited as well. That is where we'll settle this, thought Tribout. Snowbird. We'll be right back. I've got a confession to make. I've been climbing for nearly 30 years, and until a year ago, I'd never bought a piece of technical outdoor clothing. Maybe a raincoat 15 years ago and a puffy or two, but otherwise, nothing. But as I got back into sport climbing to try and finish 100 513s by my 50th birthday, I discovered that the cold winter winds of Wyoming that seemed to pick up force across the face of the crag and concentrate right on me were just too much for my usual hoodies. So I went shopping. And it takes a real event to force me to go shopping. I came home with a mid-layer that I thought I'd be able to climb in, but also might keep me from freezing up there. And I quickly discovered that the Rab Ascender light hoodie was long enough to fit easily under my harness, slim and stretchy enough to feel like it wasn't there, and had a hood that fit snugly enough on my head and neck that the wind didn't get in, and I didn't even notice the zipper. Since then, there hasn't been a single crag day that it wasn't with me. Now, I'm looking for other Rab layers that might make my experience even better. The Modulus hoodie and the Cirrus Flex insulated jacket, to be precise. And like I said, it takes a real event to make me go shopping. Rab. The mountains are our meeting place. The film begins with the camera panning over stone, the kind of stone that causes climbers' palms to sweat, that sends jolts of excitement to the fingertips. The undulating stone blurs into the ripples of a climber's suntanned back, muscles straining to stay connected to the holds, but also allowing the body of the climber to fit between them as if they were sculpted specifically to be climbed. The psychedelic soundtrack expertly weaves in and out of the shadows that fall across the naked edge, as two climbers, Duncan Ferguson and Roger Briggs, attempt to free climb the route. Bob Carmichael made the film Break On Through in 1972, hitchhiked to New York, and sold it to CBS Sports. The first time that climbing as climbers know it would be shown to the sports-loving public, and it perfectly captures the poetic push and pull of what we do. Carmichael is a climber, and understood what pieces of the sport would translate. By 1988, Bob had recognized that the new climbing competitions in Europe could potentially, if filmed and packaged correctly, appeal to the American sports audience. He connected with Jeff Lowe, who believed that the touring competition model used in Italy, France, and Germany could also work in the US. Carmichael mined his connections to get CBS Sports involved, while Lowe approached a Texas oil baron turned mountaineer and ski resort owner, Dick Bass, with the idea. Bass didn't know much about sport climbing, but he was in, even offering up his Snowbird resort in Little Cottonwood Canyon, Utah, as the location for the event. Lowe's relationships with the top climbers in Europe meant that the competition would ultimately include many of the best in the world. Top prize for both men and women would be $4,000 each, with a total purse of $17,000 up for grabs. Now, to get the wall up. Easier said than done. Remember, climbing on artificial surfaces was still brand new, largely a response to the destruction done at competitions like Bardonecchia and Arco, where roots were chipped and thousands of spectators trampled the cliffside environment. A few competitions had been run on artificial walls in Europe, but the vast majority of Americans had never even seen a wall built specifically for climbing. American Spider Dan Goodwin had some experience building artificial crack climbs, so Lowe tasked him with creating panels for the climbing wall, which was to be constructed on the side of the 115-foot-tall Cliff Lodge at Snowbird. Yosemite veteran Paul Sibley would construct the wall and affix Goodwin's panels to it, panels that were undulating in texture to mimic real rock. Goodwin would also provide the holds, ones that, much to the dismay of the route setters, Americans Alan Watts and Neil Cannon, Australian superstar Kim Kerrigan, and French climbers Jean-Marc Troussier and Jean-Claude Droyer, often cracked and spun on the uneven walls. While several holds were cemented into place to keep them from spinning, set screws on climbing holds may very well have originated from this competition. But hold on. Route setters? Route setting? What on earth was route setting? If artificial walls and modular holds were still brand new, then of course, so was the art of route setting, particularly in this capacity. And consider this, over 35 years later, we're still learning how to set fair and equitable routes for climbers. And these routes, set for the first big competition on U.S. soil at what was being billed as the International Sport Climbing Championships, were the first professionally set routes in the country. What could go wrong? Well, where do I start? Goodwin was originally given $10,000 to construct the wall, panels, and holds. He thought that might cover materials, but over $150,000, missed construction deadlines, and rumors of lawsuits later, speculation was rampant that the event would never even make it to fruition. But if climbers are anything, they're scrappy and resourceful, so the wall went up, the holds went on, the marketing went out, the competitors arrived. To showcase the climbing and the climbers, Bob Carmichael hadn't even considered the static, on-the-ground camera shots of previous climbing competitions. Having started working for NFL Film shortly after Break On Through, he knew the American sports audience wouldn't go for the butt shots. He wanted to show close-up the theater that he knew would play out as climbers wriggled their fingers into tiny pockets and lunged for impossibly far-away holds. And to make this happen, he developed a vertical dolly and winch system to transport a cameraman up and down the wall, following the climber. The first American climbing competition would get the full Hollywood treatment, before that Hollywood treatment even existed. And to help it make sense to the public, Jeff Lowe decided to stretch the event across several rounds spanning most of a week. 2 days of qualifiers, a speed climbing practice day, a semifinal round, finals, then speed climbing and a possible superfinal. The qualifiers, which began on Wednesday, June 8, 1988, were open. Anyone could pay $50 to try the route, which hovered around mid-512. More than 40 climbers paid the fee, with 6 people, 4 men and 2 women, climbing well enough to advance to the semifinal round, where 33 of the best climbers in the world had already been invited. These 2 days of qualifiers allowed Bob Carmichael some practice runs to fine-tune his system and also gave the construction and setting teams time to sort out some unfinished details. One of these was the issue of the cracks. Not the cracks in the brittle hand and footholds, but the crack climbs. This was America in the 1980s, after all, and 2 cracks had been built into the wall. The common refrain was that Americans had competed poorly in Europe due to the relative lack of face and pocket climbing in the States. Americans had led the way with crack climbing for decades, and the belief was that the Europeans didn't know how to climb cracks. Now, I can't help but believe that the cracks were built as an advantage for the American contingent, but perhaps they were simply a holdover of what American climbers identified as climbing. However, good sense prevailed, the cracks were eventually deemed unusable, and it was ordered that they be taped over. On Saturday, the 11th of June, the assembled crowd on the lawn of the Cliff Lodge, though much smaller than expected, was buzzing with excitement. Men and women would both be competing on the same route set by Smith Rock superstar Alan Watts on the jutting prow of the irregular-shaped building. At 12 plus, this route followed the left edge of the wall, climbing up and across a 20-foot-tall triangular volume, which originally had contained one of the crack climbs, before tackling the most formidable feature of the route, a huge, wave-shaped roof at 2/3 height, before finishing on a slab to the top of the building. Only a handful of big names of the time were absent. Gulich had already voiced his disdain, Moffitt chose not to compete, Backer was nursing a shoulder injury and couldn't, even if he wanted to, Stefan Glovach refused to compete on an artificial wall, Todd Skinner was off working on a project in Yosemite. Christine Gambert, Louisa Giovanni, and Beth Bennett were noticeably absent for the women. But the crowd had good reason to be buzzing. The majority of the best climbers and competitors in the world were just out of sight, waiting in isolation. American sport climbers Scott Franklin, Jim Carn, Dale Goddard, and Christian Griffith were joined by legendary stonemaster Ron Kalk, pioneering hardman Tony Yaniro, local climber Merrill Bitter, who'd paid the $50 to try the qualifier, and teenage dark horse Jason Stern. The U.S. women's field was equally stacked. Rosie Andrews, Jennifer Cole, eventual competition rivals Allison Osius and Bobby Bensman, soon-to-be World Cup queen Robin Erbisfield, stonemaster Mari Gingery, and of course, Lynn Hill. From the UK, Ben Masterson and Martin Atkinson had made the trip. From Australia, Jeff Wigand and Nairi Dodd. Our new to Kent came from Belgium. But it was the French who sent the strongest contingent. Take the word strongest however you like. Isabelle Petissier, Corinne Lebrun, and Catherine Destivelle represented the French women. For the men, Jackie Gaddafi, Alex Dubac, Marc Lemenestrel, and obviously Jibe Tribout and Patrick Edlinger. It was going to be a show. No, not just a show. A showdown. Several of them. We'll be right back. Look, I make my living as a climbing coach, but I'll be the first to tell you that ever since climbers first decided they wanted to get better, there's been one best way to improve: climb intentionally. So if you can do your climbing on terrain that was built specifically for that, it's a cheat code. And when it comes to this, there's one training board out there that stands above the rest: the Tension Board 2. Here's why. It was designed by people who actually train on boards. With mastery in mind, every decision made with purpose, and over 15,000 climbs in the database and growing, it's not even a question. On all levels, the TB2 is the final boss of training boards. The mix of wood and plastic allows for skin-friendly tiny grips as well as bigger, slopier, open-handed compression climbing. And there are 4 different board sizes to choose from, so whether you run a gym or built yourself a training shed, they've got one for you. And at the link in your show notes, you can learn all about how they made it, why they made it, and the best way for you to use it. Tension climbing. Mastery over success. Now, if you hope to put on a show, if you hope to entertain, you need one thing: Whether it's to be televised on CBS Sports or it's in front of a live audience lounging on the grass at a Utah ski lodge, there needs to be a healthy amount of drama. Jeff Lowe and Bob Carmichael knew this. The setters, who strangely were also route judges and would be hanging on ropes, jumaring up the wall alongside the climbers and studying their every move, knew this. They set their routes accordingly. As they ascended toward the top of the cliff lodge and the holds got smaller and the moves harder, the runouts between bolts grew longer and longer. This would produce some spectacular falls. Ron Kalk would take the biggest of the day, 50 feet from the lip of the roof. This was the kind of drama the crew wanted to see, and there would be plenty of it. However, putting in the effort to manufacture the drama can have unintended karmic consequences. If not held in check early, it often leaves the door open for a less desirable type of drama to slip itself in. First out to climb was Australian Jeff Wiegand. He steadily fought his way upwards, letting the crowd learn early the location of the two cruxes on the vertical wall. He struggled hard at an undercling just after the fifth bolt and scrapped his way to the middle of the big roof before he succumbed to gravity. Going man, woman, next out was French climber Corinne Lebrun, who, with her short bleached hair and flashy lycra, styled her way through the two technical cruxes as well. She nearly made it through the undercling that barred entry to the roof, but couldn't quite manage it. The crowd was getting a good show right from the start. The first American to climb, Jim Karn, chose a slightly different beta than the crowd had seen. When he grabbed a hold not yet used, it moved. There was nothing in the official rules posted in the event program that dealt with spinning or broken holds, and no rules meeting had been held. Rattled and unsure of what to do, he kept moving and fell lower than the first two climbers. The judges decided that the loose hold hadn't affected his performance, but according to Jim, it absolutely had. This was just a warm-up for the judges. Their jobs were going to get much more difficult. Soon, Jibe Tribout was led out of ISO. His job, at that moment, was to make it to finals where he could show the world and Edlinger who was actually the best. He'd just come from a 10-day trip to Smith Rock where he'd flashed several 513s and established a new 514. He began up the cliff lodge with that same determination. There was little hesitation all the way to the lip of the roof, and the crowd was going wild. Tribout matched the hold on the lip and made a huge reach toward the next hold, and came up just short. To a chorus of groans from the crowd, he lowered back to the jug on the lip and readied himself for another attempt. The crowd responded. Still short. On his fourth try, he inched his fingers onto the hold, and the crowd roared its approval as he got established above the lip, shook out, and studied the slab leading to the anchors. But the 4 attempts had taken too much. He'd soon slip off of the slab and plummet to below the big roof, to thunderous applause. Christian Griffith was the next American out, and he cleared the roof easily, seemingly poised to be the first to flash the route. However, while working out the delicate slab, Griffith noticed that he was nearing the 15-minute time limit, hurried his climbing, and fell off. Then came Destivelle. While Lynn Hill had beaten her in their most recent matchup, since accepting the invitation to Snowbird, Catherine had gone to Bukes and red-pointed Shuka, the first 8A plus ever done by a woman. The crowd at Snowbird was more than ready to see this showdown. Destivelle climbed tentatively and would fall several moves below Corinne Lebrun, the first woman out, and still the female competitor who'd gone the highest. With Lynn Hill, Isabelle Patissier, and other crushers still to come, most doubted that Destivelle would make it to the finals. They may not get this showdown after all. Those doubts quickly turned to hope when Isabelle Patissier came out and danced through the lower cruxes only to fall from the same hold as Destivelle. Patissier had reached slightly higher, so would be placed higher in the rankings, but if another best in the world could fall here, there was still hope for Destivelle to make it through. And then, a dark horse climber put those doubts firmly back into place. A relative unknown at the time, Jennifer Cole from Alabama, pulled past Petitier's high point to just below LeBrun's to secure a spot in finals. Marc Leministrel, one of the best climbers in the world, would hit the wall nearly running. He shot to the lip of the roof, and with plenty of time was able to sort out the slippery slab for the first flash. Now knowing that the route was possible, the crowd brought the hype for Lynn Hill. At only 5'1", she had to fight for the big reaches, but this wasn't her first rodeo. Lynn climbed above Destivelle's high point and fell off even with Jennifer Cole. To those keeping track, it seemed Destivelle had maybe scraped into finals. All of the big stars had climbed. Surely, there was nobody waiting in ISO who could still pass her. The men's finalists began rounding out as well. Scott Franklin, Ron Kauk, and France's Alex Dubach would all clear the lip of the roof, only to be stopped by the slab. The next climber out was a name that was familiar mostly to the California crowd. Mari Gingery had been Lynn Hill's main climbing partner for years, and wasn't far behind in skills, a fact that became clear as she passed one bolt after another. Reaching the same hold Destivelle had moved from before falling, the crowd held their breath. If Mari made it higher, even a few centimeters, she would knock Catherine from finals. And when she pulled through easily, some cheered and some gasped. Destivelle, watching from the crowd, felt a little relieved. Her heart just wasn't in it. But Tribout and Edlinger weren't the only rivalry left. Another French climber had been asserting his dominance at recent competitions. Didier Raboutou was led out to the wall and began climbing. And those who'd followed the new sport knew what they were seeing, but anyone who'd been introduced to competition climbing just that weekend must have been perplexed. Didier made it all look so easy. No second guessing, no out-of-control movements, no frustration. Just a brand of calm, steady advancing up the wall that made it seem as if there were no possibility of stumping or stymieing him. Moving past the base of the giant pyramid-shaped volume, Didier climbed into view of the route setter and judge, Alan Watts. And Alan watched on with admiration at the ease with which Didier moved. Nearing the top of the pyramid, at a stance most had struggled with, Didier relaxed to scan the roof just above and flagged a foot out over the red boundary tape. Alan immediately said, "Didier, your foot." He pulled it back and continued on, easily passing the roof and breaking his flow only at the finish as he turned around to wave at the cheering crowd. Nobody could believe what they'd witnessed. A 60-year-old non-climber in the audience turned to his wife and exclaimed, "I've never seen an athletic performance like that before. That was sheer ballet." When Edlinger came out and calmly flashed the route as well, the dominance was obvious. 3 flashes from 3 French athletes. French woman was going into finals in first place. And even though Destivelle's performance had been lackluster, the French were planting their flag. For the crowd, the day had been a success. Big falls, big sends, big drama. The finals would be a real showdown. But the organizers and judges couldn't celebrate the win. There was a different kind of drama brewing. It was going to be a long night. We'll be right back. Hey everybody, at this point, I think it's safe to say that this podcast is official. At the time that this episode's coming out, we're well on our way to 500,000 downloads, so thank you all for spreading the word. Now, I've already started collecting materials for Season 3, we're in the middle of turning Season 1 into a book, and we're considering making a trivia game. And that's where you can help. It's entirely free to become a member of our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club. You'll get bonus episodes. We do a lot of giveaways in there. We've translated climbing history books into English, and you'll get first dibs on the upcoming Written in Stone books, as well as anything else we make at special pre-order prices. And I also have some bonus things going out with the books that will only be available to the Secret Stoners. Like I said, it's free. But you can also support if you want to. We have 2 paying tiers, Rock Stars and Legends. You can also help immensely by sharing this show with your partners and your friends. The link to join is in the show notes. Thank you. Now let's bring this story home. When Didier Raboutou lowered to the base of the wall, having easily flashed the route and looking like a lock to win the entire thing, he was told he'd been disqualified for stepping out of bounds. According to Alan Watts, who set the route and was hanging only a few feet from Didier at the time of the infraction, not only did Didier not use the wall past the tape, but the tape never should have been there to begin with. Looking back at old photos, it's obvious. At the bottom of the pyramid, the red tape runs along the left edge of the volume, far away from the root. For some reason, a few feet before the top of the feature, the tape breaks dramatically across to the right edge and then follows it to the top. And this is the same pyramid feature that had a crack running up its arête, one that was deemed unusable and ordered to be covered up. Except the last few feet hadn't been covered up. Instead, someone ran tape around it to call it out. It's clear to see in the photos, but it was never what the setters intended. What's more, Mari Gingery had been flagged for going out of bounds as well. But this was brought up well after the fact, rather than at the base of the route. She'd reached her hand across the tape and quickly pulled it back. But rules are rules, and the rules must be upheld. But what rules? Because the event had been sanctioned at the last minute as a World Cup, the rules of the UIAA should have been the law. However, the official rules printed in the event program were not the UIAA rules. With construction running up to the last minute, no rules meeting had been held, leaving it unclear to everyone, including the competitors, what the rules even were. The official rules in the program stated, "The competitors are not allowed to use holds beyond the colored lines which delimit the course. In case a part of the body goes beyond the lines, the judges will establish whether this was used for support or only for balance." Alan Watts was positive that Didier had only used the foot for balance and that the route would have been no easier had he smeared and stood there. However, the UIAA rule was different. A climber will be halted and the high point recorded if the climber crosses over the route boundaries. By this rule, Raboutou was out. Everyone was split on what to do. American Alpine Club president Jim McCarthy agreed to mediate and analyze the two fouls in order to sort out the issue. Easier said than done. Carmichael had it all on film, but that wouldn't be ready to watch for a few days. This was 1988, after all. Not to mention, this move violated two more rules from the official program. Rule 16 stated, "A temporary standing will be given immediately after the competition. This standing will be official if no written dispute is given the judges within half an hour." As of yet, there were no standings, and there hadn't been disputes about Raboutou or Gingery. Rule 17 stated, "In case of disputes, the judges will be the final arbitrators and will make their decision within 2 hours of the end of each day's competition." Even if there had been disputes, with McCarthy stepping in, the judges were no longer the final word. Ultimately, using a video taken by a spectator from 50 feet below, it was decided that Raboutou had weighted his out-of-bounds foot, despite Watts a few feet away at the moment in question arguing otherwise. This meant that it came down to the height of the infraction, which kept him out of finals. Though I haven't seen anywhere that it was ever officially stated, even to the competitors, it certainly seems that by this time, the official rules as written in the event program had been entirely disregarded. Mari Gingery's case was even more complicated. Nobody had noted her high point when she reached out of bounds. At their best guess, based on the video, it still qualified her to move on. So a final standings list was published. Lebrun, Cole, Patissier, Gingery, and Hill. However, while watching the Spectator video, Kim Kerrigan thought that Destivelle's high point might have been miscalculated. He and Troussier went up the wall early Sunday to measure and determined that she had tied with Gingery. Destivelle was back in. Now, in Destivelle's book Rock Queen, she claims that she was also initially disqualified for going out of bounds. However, I can't find evidence of this in any articles, books, or video. I suspect her memory is simply clouded due to the amount of drama surrounding the whole thing. Regardless, she had gone out and enjoyed the night, and when told she was back in, was, according to her, tucking into serious quantities of muffins. She couldn't believe it. Nobody could. At the competitor meeting that morning, Isabelle Patissier, who'd witnessed similar judging patterns when it came to Destivelle, protested and ultimately boycotted the awards banquet. These decisions in the competitor meeting didn't do much to end the drama. Instead, Lowe allowed the competitors' objections to sway several other decisions about the rules. First, the 15-minute time limit was struck down for an added 5 minutes. Ironically, nobody would come close to 15 minutes in finals. Second, and more consequential, he deleted rule number 14, which stated, "The final results will be drawn up by taking the sum of the meters covered during the 2 rounds." So this means that whoever climbed the highest in finals was the winner. Any major struggle at the top of the semifinal had simply been wasted energy, and any strategies competitors had been taking as truth were no longer in play. And I mean, I like the rule better that what happens in finals is really what counts, but rules are... Wait, never mind. By this time, we know that rules are malleable. Jim McCarthy would later comment, "You can't have the inmates running the institution." I have no idea if the crowd in attendance was aware of the level of drama going on. Maybe they were, maybe not. And the competitors certainly were aware, and it sure must have looked as if Destivelle was receiving favorable treatment. Jeff Lowe later commented that it was all done in the name of trying to be fair, though it must have seemed pretty different to Didier Raboutou. But for the most part, the inmates just wanted to climb. And so they got on with it. Under an overcast gray sky, the top 10 men and 6 women would face the 13B finals route dubbed the Lacerator, set by Kim Kerrigan. First out was Marc Lemenestrel, who once again impressed the crowd with his speed and precision. Not particularly tall, Lemenestrel hit huge move after huge move. This seemed to be a defining characteristic of many of the French climbers, who perhaps had a head start with this style due to bouldering at Fontainebleau during their early years. But it also gave the crowd a look at the size of the moves. Any climbers in attendance must have been nervous for the women, as most of them were several inches shorter than Lemenestrel. Just below the big roof, he gassed out and fell off. A good showing for the first climber of the day. Alex Dubach was next out, and the first victim of one of the earlier big moves. Then Jennifer Cole and Scott Franklin were both stopped for the same reason, but lower. Mari Gingery would find a tiny, sneaky crimp on the edge of a wall panel to pull through one of the giant moves and establish a new high point for the women. And then Jibe Tribout was led out to the wall, ready to make his statement. The crowd remembered his fight at the lip of the roof from the previous day and were eager to see him again do battle with the imposing feature. He easily reached Lemenestrel's high point, and as an already seasoned competitor, reached high to tap the wall above where his fellow countrymen had. And this put him in first place. Judge Neil Cannon, hanging nearby, estimates that while good tactics for ensuring his place above Lemenestrel, this proved fatal for Tribout, as he seemingly lost his balance and concentration and fell trying to make the next move. One after another, the best climbers in the world came out and fell low on the wall. Bryn LeBrun, coming into finals in first place, came off just above the 4th bolt. Both Jason Stern and Christian Griffith struggled and fell below where Lemenestrel had started the day. Ron Kalk, Isabelle Patissier, and Jeff Wigand were all out before they even made it to the halfway point. Finally, to the crowd's delight, Lynn Hill stood below the wall. She showed a nearly unmatched level of mastery while tiptoeing over the bulge down low. The crowd held their collective breath as Lynn approached the first of the gigantic moves in the vertical section. Lynn's prowess was evident here, hitting several full extension moves and jumps in a row, often to precise pockets. But these powerful throws took their toll, and at the same point where Gingery had fallen, Lynn too came up short. Destivelle was the last woman to leave ISO. She had, according to her book, though that's the only source that mentions it, requested and was granted a later start due to learning she was in finals just that morning. She wasn't happy about her situation, but once on the wall, allowed that to fade into the background. The mostly American crowd was rooting for Lynn Hill, but as Destivelle climbed higher, the shouts of encouragement grew more exuberant. And when she reached the current highest female position shared by Gingery and Hill, the tense excitement hung in the air. With her hands spread wide on side pulls cranked down to her waist and her feet high, she was also feeling the tension, though not entirely aware that she was in a three-way tie for first place. Some competitors compete against the other climbers. Some compete against the climb. I'm not passing judgment here about which method is better, but the two are almost certainly driven by a contrasting sort of spirits. For her part, Destivelle just wanted to climb. She would later write that being embroiled in another unfortunate situation would cause her to give up competition climbing. I needed something different, new experiences, sensations, adventures, freedom, and open spaces. I needed to be able to express myself freely, to be independent, to make my own plans, and to be myself. I needed to stop feeling manipulated by the media, by my so-called career as a professional sportswoman, and the pressure from certain sponsors to look the best. But right at that moment, she was mid-climb, and all that meant was that she had to try hard. Feet scrabbling to get as high as possible, she was just able to stretch to the next hold, higher than any woman had gone. A few more moves, and she was off. I won the competition, she writes, but the victory left a bad taste in my mouth. I'm taller than Lynn, which is why I was able to reach a hold with the tips of my fingers that she was unable to stretch to. I felt guilty to have won like that. But height is often an issue. It wasn't new then, and over 35 years later, it's still a reoccurring challenge for setters and competitors alike. Instead, it was the vagueness of the rules that allowed Destivelle to be out, then back in at the last minute, that was the real problem. Let's look at what the results would have been had the official rules been held to. Best I can tell, this means Destivelle doesn't make it to finals at all. There was no dispute levied on her behalf. Corinne Lebrun, who fell low in finals, would have won the entire competition based on her combined height from the 2 rounds. In fact, even with Destivelle in, she would have tied for first, forcing a superfinal, which was already set around the corner. Either way, Lynn would have been second, with Mari coming in third. But that isn't how it played out. In fact, it seemed as if the whole finals would be a complete disaster. Nobody had even touched the roof at 2/3 height. Hanging on a platform, camera in hand, Bob Carmichael's radio crackled to life. It was the control booth. Man, this whole thing sucks. Carmichael, the veteran of filming sports and the athletes who so often rise to the occasion, responded calmly. Don't worry, someone will make it to the top. But there was only one climber left, and he was in ISO, wrapped in blankets, nearly asleep. Roused from his cocoon, Patrick Edlinger walked out under the gray skies with headphones on, refusing to even look at the wall. He didn't consider it a true onside if he so much as glanced upward before he was ready to climb. And if anything, he believed himself to be principled. High in the hotel balconies with a view of the as-of-yet unclimbed roof sat Jim McCarthy, and next to him, Hot Henry Barber. Edlinger's hero, Barber was a man of tradition and held the same concern as much of the old guard, that both the new sport climbing tactics and the competitions were likely to dilute the spirit of climbing. Edlinger was determined not to allow that to happen. Later, he would say that his goal was not to win, but to climb the route proposed to me and to show others what climbing is all about. Of Tribout's high point, the chalky handprint high on the wall where there was no hold, Edlinger would comment, "Climbing is too noble for that type of action." Climbing is not a sport, it is a way of life. The way you get to the top expresses who you are, your values, the type of life you're living. It was this very ethos that made him something of a pariah. Climbing had been changing rapidly all around him. In his home country, he'd seemingly disappeared from the crags, choosing to avoid the crowds that congregated under the most popular routes. Those climbers who engaged in the fray thought that Edlinger must be washed up, embarrassed to fail in public. They were wrong. He calmly booted up and danced through the bulge that had stopped several competitors. Reaching a huge move that had only been passed a couple of times via a massive dead point, he hesitated only briefly. He then jacked his foot up higher than seemed possible, locked the hold off at his waist, and made the reach statically. The crowd went wild. Edlinger didn't notice. One high step after another, he made the gigantic spans seem elementary. At Tribout's high point, he didn't even hesitate, taking the small mono pocket and pulling to the base of the roof. He'd already won. Below him, pandemonium. Edlinger didn't notice. As if warming up, he easily moved across the roof. He extended his full length and latched a hold over the lip. As his fingers wrapped around the hold, in a moment that Alison Osius would later call a benediction, the gray clouds were suddenly pierced by a single shaft of sunlight, trained perfectly on Patrick Edlinger. Bedlam erupted. People ran backwards to get a view of the slab that they'd long ago stopped even considering. Edlinger, matched on the lip, stepped a foot high and rocked up into a no-hand stance. With everyone in attendance losing their minds, Patrick glanced over to Judge Neil Cannon, hanging a few feet away, and said,
"I think no one has been here."
But he wasn't done. He didn't come here to win. He came to meet the challenge of the route, and there was plenty of challenge remaining. For Climbing Magazine in August of 1988, Michael Binge wrote,
He started up the dicey-looking slab. The crowd howled when he screwed his right-hand pinky into a hole, then pulled through to a tenuous stance. The next bit was mind-bending. He placed his left foot at shoulder height and cranked onto it to everyone's bewilderment. In seconds, he had clipped the top anchor to a background of a crowd gone wild.
As he lowered from the top of the cliff lodge, having decisively won the first annual International Sport Climbing Championship at Snowbird, Patrick Edlinger looked over into the balconies, flashed a thumbs up to his hero, Henry Barber, and shouted,
"For you!"
1, 2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. Over the next couple of weeks, our patrons will be getting bonus episodes about changing ethics and the rise of competition climbing. You can join for free at the link in your show notes. And remember, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review, join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know. At the crag, at the gym, even at the competitions. Tell them all, and together, we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners. This episode tried my patience. For a lot of reasons, actually. It was hard to find the truth, and I suppose that shouldn't even be an issue. I should just know by now, and I do, that none of this is truth. Everybody's memories are different. However,
I have an article in Climbing Magazine and an article in Rock and Ice Magazine, both published immediately after Snowbird, that say conflicting things. And I've talked to several people involved in the making of Snowbird who said other things. So there are multiple stories floating around, and it's hard to tell what's what. Ultimately, though, most of it really doesn't matter. And I think that I was able to get to the heart of this thing. That, yes, there are rivalries. How each person in that rivalry views it, frames it, and remembers it is a totally different thing. They're going to use it how they want to use it, what they need from it is what they're going to take away from it. I think that's fascinating. But before I go any further, shout out to Stephen Barrett, our newest rock star. I appreciate you. This thing just keeps growing, and that makes me really happy. It also stresses me out a little because it does indicate to me that this thing is important. Telling these stories are important. And that makes me feel responsible for telling them responsibly. Responsible for telling them responsibly? Yeah, basically, that's what I mean. And that brings with it a little more, I have to get it right. But to be totally and completely honest with you, I'm going to fight that every step of the way because, like I said, what is right? One person's memory of the event is different than the other person's memory of the event is different than the next person's memory of the event. So all I'm trying to do is take the larger lessons, the larger connections, the things that have come together to mold this culture into what it is today. That's really what I'm trying to do. But also, this episode tried me because there's a lot of moving pieces. There are a lot of competitors doing different things. There are a lot of rules that are clashing, and trying to determine what the rules were back in 1988 is an interesting thing. And then the actual mixing of the episode, which I'm fairly sure I still did not get right. It's 3 p.m. on Sunday. You guys are getting this tomorrow. So like 15 hours after I'm recording this right now, it will be going out live. And at some point, I just have to step away because mixing all of the crowd sounds with the music, with the dialogue, and really, I've only had a week of writing this thing. And I took a 2-day break to go climb with Arnout Kent and Jibe Tribout and Joe Brooks. All legends. It was really fun. Jibe sent his project and showed why he's Jibe Tribout, because he did not look that close the first couple of goes that I saw him. And it seemed like that was it for the day. And then he just pulled it out of nowhere, which was very cool to watch at 60-some years old, how hard he's trying on this steep panel of 2-finger pockets and really just going for it. It was really cool to watch. But also, I got Jibe to sign some things for me. Because we've got the book for season 1, the 1990s, coming somewhat soon, I reached out to Lynn Hill and I reached out to Jibe. Lynn is sending me signed photos of her on the nose. I got Jibe to sign a bunch of photos of him on Just Do It. And those are going to be bonuses for pre-orders of the book when they're available. And of course, all of you, the Secret Stoners, are going to get first dibs on those. We only have a limited number, but that limited number is pretty big. I think all total with Lynn and Jibe's, we have like 60 or something signed photos, which is very fun and very cool. And I have some photos of Jibe signing just for provenance, you know? I gotta prove this is real, that I just didn't sign his name. So whenever pre-orders are up and running, the first 60 or so people will get one of those signed photos. Also, another thing, in talking to competitors, in talking to setters, in talking to people in the crowd, as well as camera crew, the whole thing seems radically different from every perspective, which is both frustrating and fun. Because I get to shape it the way I want to shape it, and nothing is wrong as long as I stick to the facts that we think we know. I tried my best to get video of this thing. The video of the competition is not out there. I reached out to the Alpine Club. They don't have it. I had a great phone conversation with Bob Carmichael, and he does have all of the video, but it's all on 1-inch reels. And he said either I would have to come to Boulder, or we could maybe Zoom and he would load up the reels and we could play it. But of course, I had a little over a week to make this episode, so that was not going to happen. But someday it would be really fun to get to see all of that. I would still love to see the moment that Edlinger turns the lip of the roof, and that sunbeam comes out and hits him right there at the lip of the roof. I would love to see that moment. I would also just love to know exactly what happened in the rules and whether Destivelle's memory of going out of bounds is correct, where none of the articles say that. She actually makes it a real point to say anyone watching would have thought that I did it on purpose. So her memory must be very distinct to write it in that way. But that's not what any of the articles say. But who knows? And then there's the case of Didier. What would have happened if Didier hadn't gone out of bounds? We already know that Edlinger's life is tragic, that he didn't handle all of this well in his later years. And I'm curious what role this legend of Snowbird played in that. If he hadn't won, does he go down the same tragic path? Or does he avoid it because it doesn't build up his ego even further? Or does it cause him to spiral sooner? I have no idea. I just think it's an interesting question. But also, I would just love to see Didier's climb. In every article I read, it was discussed as if no one had ever seen someone climb this well. So I would love to see that. And I've climbed around Didier a couple of times, and he's a good climber, but I'm seeing him in his, 50s, 60s or something. So I can only imagine what he would have been back then in his prime, and compared to all of the other people who were, just finding this brand new thing. A lot of the Americans had never touched an artificial climbing hold. So just an interesting moment that I had a lot of fun digging into. I debated whether this was going to make it into the season because obviously it's not rock climbing. It's, artificial. It's an indoor, essentially, climbing. It's gym climbing, even though it's outside. But it's such a pivotal moment in American climbing, and it helped shape competition climbing and indoor climbing all the way to now. So I really felt like it had to happen, especially after Jerry winning leads being the end of that episode, it seemed like it led into this episode really well. So, there you have it. All right. Next week, a really fun interview that, man, I feel so lucky to be able to have these kinds of conversations with people. And we're going to find out. We're going to get closer to finding out, get closer to knowing what might have happened had Didier Raboutou not gone out of bounds and been disqualified. All right. I'll see you then.